Early 1916, the Western Front was a landscape of utter devastation. Mud, smoke, and the cries of dying soldiers filled the air. But among all the carnage, what struck Lieutenant Colonel Peter Norman Nissen the most were the men shivering in their canvas tents, the men who had survived artillery barrages, but now found themselves dying from exposure. The cold, the rain, the endless winds, it was relentless. Nissen wasn't just another officer inspecting the situation. He was a Canadian-born mining engineer, trained to think practically. But there was nothing practical about the situation at hand. The usual ways of providing shelter, timber, stone, and bricks, were impossible to obtain. Soldiers, cold and vulnerable, had little more than thin tents to protect them from the elements. For weeks, Nissen watched as corrugated iron sheets, meant for roofing, lay abandoned at supply depots. No one knew what to do with them. They were surplus, not designed for shelter. And yet, Nissen couldn't help but notice how useless those sheets seemed to be just sitting there. A thought began to take root in his mind. What if these discarded materials could be the answer to saving lives? Nissen had always approached problems with a miner's mindset, break things down to their simplest form, and find a way to make it work. What if those iron sheets, bent into a half-cylinder, could form a sturdy shelter? No internal supports, no timber beams, no need for skilled carpenters, just the material at hand. In those cold, frozen trenches, the idea was a flicker of hope. Could it work? He wasn't sure, but he was determined to try. The construction sites near Ypres became his laboratory. He had only basic tools and a team of 6 soldiers who had never built anything before. No one believed it was possible. But Nissen wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for a way to survive. When the first prototype went up, there were no fanfares, no speeches. Just a metal shelter, standing quietly amid the chaos. Nissen watched as the soldiers who had helped him construct it stood back, looking at it in amazed silence. It wasn't much, but it was something. A shelter that could be built quickly and efficiently with little more than basic materials. What followed next felt like a breakthrough, a promise. Nissen told the army, any infantryman with basic instructions could build this in 3 days. That promise wasn't just about building shelter, it was about giving the soldiers back their dignity. They didn't need to rely on expert builders. They just needed the right tools, a little instruction, and a sense of purpose. Would the army believe in his idea? Could the simple Nissen hut stand up to the harsh conditions of warfare? Nissen's prototype was barely out of the ground when the British Army Command came to inspect it. Skepticism ran high. The Nissen hut, with its metal sides, was nothing like the traditional barracks they were used to. But what struck them more was its simplicity. No complicated frames, no trained laborers, just corrugated sheets bolted together. Could this really work in the harsh conditions of the Western Front? The Army agreed to put it to the test. April 1916 arrived, and with it, the 172nd Tunneling Company was tasked with assembling 20 huts at Richborough Port. The soldiers, already jaded by the suffering of war, approached the task with doubt. Could they really build something that would withstand the brutality of the battlefield? Could this metal hut protect them from artillery fire, freezing temperatures, and rain? What followed was a journey from skepticism to belief. As the soldiers worked, they began to understand the true genius of the Nissen hut. The structure wasn't just simple, it was ingenious. The curved roof shed rain and shrapnel, while the lack of vertical walls meant there were no weak spots. And the most amazing part? It could be assembled by just a few soldiers in a short time, under the worst conditions. The first few huts were slow to assemble, but the soldiers quickly realized the potential. They saw how quickly the structures went up, how little effort was required to make them functional, and how efficiently they kept the men sheltered. Soon, the design's impact became clear. This wasn't just a shelter. This was a revolution in military construction, designed to meet the immediate, life-saving needs of soldiers in the field. In June 1916, the British Army placed an order for 10,000 huts. The demand was overwhelming, but the Nissen hut had proven its worth. It wasn't just a temporary fix, it was the solution. As the war raged on, the Western Front became a graveyard of broken promises and unfulfilled potential. Soldiers fought against more than just their enemies. They fought against the elements, too. Exposure was a silent killer. Men were dying from the cold, from the rain, from the lack of shelter. The enemy didn't need to fire a single shot to cause devastation. And yet, amidst this chaos, something had changed. The Nissen hut, a humble structure born from a miner's ingenuity, was now offering something no one else could, a solution to the immediate shelter crisis. By June 1916, the British Army had deployed its first Nissen huts along the front lines. These simple, curved metal structures began replacing the fragile tents that had once served as the primary shelter. The first reports came back with a sense of surprise. Soldiers, who had long endured freezing nights huddled under canvas, now had a safe space that stood strong against the storm. The huts were up quickly, they were weatherproof, and most importantly, they kept the men warm and dry. What struck the soldiers most wasn't just the physical structure, it was what it represented: survival. For the first time, they weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting to stay alive, to stay warm, and to keep their comrades safe. And Nissen's design was a beacon of hope in that war-torn world. But the true impact of the Nissen hut wasn't only felt in its immediacy. It was in the speed of its deployment and the simplicity of its design. While traditional military shelters required skilled carpenters and engineers, the Nissen hut could be constructed by just a handful of soldiers. No experience was needed. The pre-drilled holes, the prefabricated panels, and the self-supporting structure meant that it didn't matter where you were. You could build a secure structure in just a few days. In April 1916, the 172nd Tunneling Company in Richborough became the first to test the new design on a larger scale. The company had been tasked with building 20 huts, and the pressure was on. The soldiers had only a few days to prove that Nissen's design was more than just an experiment. Could it stand up to the stress of war? The result was remarkable. What took traditional construction teams weeks to build, the Nissen hut could be erected in days. It wasn't just about the speed, it was about adaptability. The huts were durable, weatherproof, and ready for anything. The curved roof shed rain, and the lack of vertical walls made them resistant to shrapnel damage. They were simple, but they were built to last. For the soldiers who spent long, grueling hours constructing these shelters, the Nissen hut wasn't just an object, it was a symbol. It was a breath of fresh air in the midst of suffocating hardship. These men had been living in constant fear, waiting for the next round of shelling, unsure of where their next shelter would come from. And now, with Nissen's design, they could rest, even if just for a moment, knowing that they were safe from the elements. As the British Army expanded its use of the huts across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, they proved their worth in numerous military applications. They weren't just for barracks. They were used for field hospitals, supply depots, and command posts. They were deployed on the front lines in the middle of battle, and even behind enemy lines, where shelter was scarce and time was of the essence. But the real test came when the War Office placed an order for 10,000 units in August 1916, just a few months after the initial success of the huts. It was a game-changing order, one that would supply the British Army with a practical, immediate solution for its shelter needs as winter approached. And by November 1918, more than 100,000 Nissen huts were standing across Europe, each one representing a small victory in a war that had taken so much from the men fighting it. The Nissen hut's speed and simplicity meant that it could be built in the midst of war, even while under heavy bombardment. At the Battle of the Somme in late 1916, construction units were building huts in artillery range, offering immediate shelter to soldiers who had just been evacuated from the front. The idea that these simple structures could be erected in under 3 days in most chaotic of circumstances seemed almost miraculous. But even with all the success and rapid deployment, there remained a question. Could this simple structure really stand up to the demands of the future? Could it be adapted for long-term use, or would it fall short when the war ended and the soldiers returned to a more stable world? By September 1940, the United States Navy found itself at a crossroads. War had not yet officially entered America's doorstep, but the tension in Europe was palpable. Commander George F. Dorat, stationed at the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington, was tasked with assessing British temporary construction methods. The Nissen hut, the simplest and fastest shelter ever created in wartime, had caught his attention. Dorat spent 6 weeks touring military bases, RAF airfields, and Royal Navy installations in England and Scotland. He was drawn to the Nissen hut, which had played a pivotal role in keeping the British forces sheltered during their struggles in the war. What struck Dorat most wasn't just the design, it was the speed with which these huts were erected. The ability to create shelter quickly and efficiently in the most hostile conditions was a lesson America could learn. When Dorat filed his report in November 1940, it was clear the Nissen hut's speed was unmatched, and its design was exactly what the United States needed in its coming military expansion. But there was a caveat: modifications would be necessary. As Dorat saw it, American forces would need a shelter that was as durable as it was quick to deploy. The Nissen hut, despite its brilliance, had limitations. It was designed for immediate survival, not long-term use. And with America's vast military expansion on the horizon, there was a need for a more permanent structure, one that could handle heavier equipment, plumbing, and electrical systems. In December 1941, the United States was drawn into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the urgency to expand its military infrastructure became critical. The U.S. Navy Civil Engineering Corps chose Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island as the site for a new experiment. They wanted to take the Nissen design and make it American, transforming it into something that could endure long enough to support the Navy's growing presence on the front lines. A team of engineers, led by Commander John Barney Cyrus, began the process of redesigning the shelter. They retained the basic shape of the Nissen hut, the curved roof, but the key difference was the internal steel framework. Instead of relying on the corrugated sheets to provide structural support, the Quonset hut used steel arches, which could support heavier equipment and be fitted with more extensive systems like plumbing and electrical wiring. For the American engineers, this was a logical progression. They didn't just want something quick. They wanted a shelter that could last longer and withstand the intense pressures of both military operations and wartime logistics. The Quonset hut was meant to serve as a semi-permanent structure, capable of housing soldiers for extended periods and withstanding harsh conditions. It was also intended to house heavy machinery, making it suitable for air bases and equipment storage. But as Cyrus and his team began to build the first prototype in February 1942, it became clear that their version of the Quonset hut came with new challenges. The steel framework added complexity. Now each hut needed steel arch ribs, which had to be precisely formed and positioned correctly before attaching the corrugated panels. The result was a much longer construction time, an entire day or more, compared to the Nissen hut's speed. In March 1942, the team at Quonset Point completed their first set of Quonset huts. The shelters were stronger, but they were also more complicated to assemble. The steel ribs, which made the Quonset hut more durable, also meant that every unit had to be assembled with precision, increasing the likelihood of delays if any parts were damaged during shipment or failed to fit properly. Despite the additional complexities, the Quonset hut offered more comfort and durability. With insulated interiors, larger windows, and the ability to support heavier loads, it seemed like the perfect solution for military bases in places like Europe and the Pacific, where long-term infrastructure would be needed. The Quonset hut was designed to provide comfort, something that would become crucial as the United States prepared for a prolonged conflict. But the question remained, was this added complexity worth it? Could the Nissen hut's simplicity, which allowed it to be constructed instantly, still be the better option for rapid deployment in the chaotic conditions of war? As the war continued, the United States would face the same dilemma that the British had already confronted: speed versus durability. Could the Quonset hut's added features outweigh the Nissen hut's unmatched speed of deployment? The answer would come in the form of battlefield trials, where engineers would test both designs in real-world conditions. But one thing was clear: both huts were born out of the same fundamental need, the need for shelter and the urgency to provide it fast. As you reflect on the Quonset hut's design, do you think the added features were worth the extra construction time? Or did the speed of the Nissen hut outweigh its more basic design? Let's hear your thoughts below. The American engineers at Quonset Point had a monumental task ahead of them. They were not just trying to build shelters, they were trying to build something that would help sustain an army for years to come. Their Quonset hut, with its internal steel framework and added comforts, was a leap forward in terms of durability and functionality. But with that leap came a stark realization. The construction process was significantly slower than that of the British-made Nissen hut. By March 1942, when the first American Quonset hut prototype was completed, the design had already begun to reveal its trade-offs. The steel arch ribs had to be carefully positioned, and with them came the complexity of assembly. What once could have been put together in a matter of days now required more time, more precision, and more delicate handling. A single 40-foot Quonset hut required no less than 14 steel ribs, each weighing 90 pounds. These ribs had to be carefully bolted to the foundation before the corrugated panels could be affixed. Unlike the Nissen hut, where the panels themselves were self-supporting, the Quonset design required the framework to bear the weight of a structure before the panels could be added. It wasn't just about getting it up quickly. It was about creating something that could endure the rigors of war for years to come. At Quonset Point, where the first American prototypes were tested, engineers worked diligently to refine the process. They learned quickly that speed, the thing that had made the Nissen hut such a breakthrough, was not necessarily the priority in their design. The goal was to create something that could support heavier equipment, serve as a multifunctional space, and withstand the harshest environments. But in doing so, they had sacrificed the very thing that had made Nissen's design so revolutionary, its simplicity. The Nissen hut had been conceived as a quick solution, built to meet the immediate need for shelter. The pre-drilled holes, simple corrugated panels, and no-frills assembly allowed it to be constructed under fire with minimal labor. It was a structure that didn't demand much in terms of precision. It just needed to go up fast and keep soldiers safe. Speed was the Nissen hut's strength, but its simplicity was also its limitation. It wasn't designed to house heavy equipment or support complex plumbing systems. Its beauty lay in its quick deployment, but as American engineers began to develop the Quonset hut, it was clear that the stakes had changed. Whereas the Nissen hut was designed for survival in the moment, the Quonset hut was meant to endure for years. With its insulated interiors, larger windows, and support for modern infrastructure, the Quonset design was the American response to the evolving needs of a global war. It was a shelter for a different kind of conflict, one that would require more sophistication and long-term planning. But as the engineers and soldiers began to test the new design, they were confronted with a challenge the Nissen hut had never faced: time. Despite the added durability, the complexity of the Quonset hut meant that construction teams could only complete a hut in 2 to 3 days, a marked improvement over traditional military shelters, but still a far cry from the instantaneous deployment of the Nissen hut. At Quonset Point, the engineering team had worked through trial and error, learning how to manage the complex assembly. But the real test came when the first full-scale deployments began. The Navy Civil Engineering Corps had to put the Quonset hut to the test in the field, in the real conditions of war. Would the added comfort and durability make it worth the extra time? The early reports from Pacific bases were mixed. While the Quonset hut's strength and comfort were praised by those who used it, the construction delays were often a source of frustration. Crews had to carefully position the steel arches and secure the structure, which took longer than anticipated. In some cases, crews faced supply shortages, and the added time meant that many early installations were delayed by days, even weeks. The Nissen hut, with its no-frills approach, would have had its walls up in hours. The Quonset hut, in contrast, required careful attention to detail and more materials, especially the steel arches, which made up the core of its framework. It was a more complex system, but with that complexity came a promise of longevity. Still, there were moments when the Nissen hut's simplicity seemed to reign supreme. In emergency situations, like the rapid deployment needs of forward operating bases or mobile units, the quick erection of Nissen-style shelters would continue to be a game-changer. It wasn't just about construction speed. It was about getting soldiers out of the mud and into shelter before the next wave of artillery or airstrikes could take their toll. The tension between speed and durability would continue to play out, as the war progressed. The American military needed both, but time was the most precious commodity. Soldiers needed to be housed immediately and securely, but could they afford to wait for the extra complexity of the Quonset hut? The engineers at Quonset Point, faced with this challenge, were forced to accept that in times of emergency, speed might be the deciding factor. As the war raged on and the Allied forces gained momentum, one question loomed large: which shelter would prove more effective in the long term? The Nissen hut had become synonymous with quick, efficient shelter, an answer to the pressing need for survival. It was a structure that could be built under fire, standing strong against the elements and providing instant refuge in the chaos of war. Its simplicity and speed had saved countless lives. But the reality of war also demanded more than just shelter. As the Allied forces moved deeper into enemy territory, the needs of the military evolved. The forces had become more sophisticated, requiring not just shelter, but also comfort, durability, and the ability to support complex infrastructure. The Quonset hut, while slower to build, offered something the Nissen hut couldn't: a foundation for long-term survival. For engineers like Commander John Barney Cyrus and his team, the task wasn't just about creating a shelter. It was about building something that could endure. Nissen's design, for all its brilliance, wasn't designed for long-term use. It was immediate, temporary, and designed for rapid deployment in the most dire of circumstances. The Quonset hut, on the other hand, was crafted with an eye toward long-term sustainability. Its internal steel framework made it stronger, able to house heavier machinery, and withstand harsher environments for extended periods. The insulation, the larger windows, and the ability to support complex systems made the Quonset hut ideal for more permanent installations. Yet as the world learned its very complexity, the need for precision, the additional steps in assembly, and the weight of its materials made a less practical choice when speed was paramount. In Pacific theaters, where the conflict had already escalated by 1943, the difference between the two shelters became even more pronounced. The American military was under tremendous pressure to set up bases and medical facilities with incredible urgency. The Nissen hut had been built with speed in mind. Speed of deployment was crucial to providing immediate shelter. There was no time to wait for precise steel framing or to account for delays in the assembly process. In many cases, soldiers simply couldn't afford to spend days, let alone weeks, building a structure. The Nissen hut's rapid deployment, a shelter in a matter of hours, became imperative for success on the front lines. At Pearl Harbor, just after the attack in December 1941, the immediate need for quick shelter led the U.S. Navy to rely on the Nissen hut for temporary housing and ward spaces. Its ability to be erected quickly meant that medical units could treat soldiers within hours of the attack, housing over 2,000 injured personnel in a matter of days. It wasn't perfect, but it was effective in the immediate aftermath. When soldiers were under fire, the ability to create a safe haven in just a few hours mattered more than the comforts of insulation or electrical systems. But the long-term legacy of these shelters will be determined not just by their speed, but by their ability to adapt to changing military needs. As the war wound down and the soldiers returned home, the utility of the Quonset hut began to show its true value. The insulated, durable design made it ideal for post-war construction, where its strength and ability to house machinery, administrative buildings, and even homes would outlast the war itself. By 1946, the Quonset hut found itself playing a role far beyond its military purpose. Surplus huts, no longer needed for wartime shelters, found their way to civilians, farmers, small businesses, and even housing units for veterans. The versatility of the Quonset hut had become its strength. With some modifications, the shelter could become a storage shed, a small business, or even a home for families. In small towns across America, you could see the Quonset hut being adapted to serve long after the war had ended. Meanwhile, the Nissen hut, while still serving a purpose in places like agriculture and small-scale storage, had largely been phased out in favor of more permanent structures. The British government had dismantled many of its wartime huts, displacing them as quickly as possible to make way for post-war infrastructure. The need for speed during wartime had given way to a desire for aesthetic and permanence in the post-war era. Yet, in the shadow of both designs, there was a common theme. The Nissen hut had proven that speed and practicality, simplicity in the face of war's complexity, could save lives. The Quonset hut, meanwhile, had proven that durability and comfort could support a more sustained effort in the war effort. Each had its place, each had its strengths. But it was the speed of the Nissen hut that had proved the most revolutionary. It had changed the very way the military thought about building shelters, and it did so when it was needed most. As the dust of war began to settle and soldiers returned home, the world they returned to was one vastly different from the one they had left behind. The war had reshaped not only the political and social landscape, but also the very infrastructure of the countries involved. And in this rebuilding process, the two iconic huts, the Nissen hut and the Quonset hut, would go on to serve very different, yet equally significant purposes. The Quonset hut, with its insulated interiors and ability to house machinery, plumbing, and electricity, found itself playing a key role in the American military's post-war infrastructure. But its role in civilian life was equally profound. As the War Assets Administration worked to clear surplus military supplies, the Quonset hut became a readily available option for small businesses and farmers, especially those who were struggling to rebuild after the destruction of war. The Quonset hut's versatility allowed it to be adapted for countless uses. It became a small workshop, a storage facility, and for some even a home. In rural areas across the United States, you could find Quonset huts serving as grain storage, machinery sheds, or even veteran housing villages. The U.S. Navy's production capacity had ensured that these huts were readily available, and they quickly became a symbol of the country's post-war recovery. The Quonset's durability, insulation, and comfort meant it was more than just a temporary solution. It was a structure that could serve decades beyond the war's end. In small towns, Quonset huts became homes for families, with many modified to include wooden floors, drywall, and even roofs that matched local architecture. They became an affordable, practical, and durable solution in a time of severe housing shortages. In contrast, the Nissen hut's legacy was more fleeting. While it had served its purpose as a quick-deploying shelter during the war, its simplicity meant that, after the war, it was quickly seen as a symbol of wartime austerity. The British government, determined to move beyond the lean times of the war, began dismantling the Nissen huts. In many cases, the corrugated iron panels were sold for scrap metal during the post-war steel shortage. In rural Britain, however, a handful of Nissen huts found new life. Farmers converted them into barns and equipment storage, but their usefulness in civilian life was limited. They were functional, but the lack of comfort and permanence kept them from becoming as widespread as the Quonset hut in civilian use. The contrasting fates of these two structures reflected the very nature of their designs. The Nissen hut was born of necessity, a solution designed for immediate shelter in a time of crisis. Its speed of deployment and minimalism were its greatest strengths during the war, but in the post-war years, its very simplicity became a limitation. The Quonset hut, on the other hand, was built for the future. Its design, though more complex, allowed it to be adapted for the needs of a growing, modern world. In the 1950s, Nissen huts continued to serve as basic shelters for a small number of military installations and in remote agricultural areas, but their numbers were dwindling. The Quonset hut, however, continued to thrive in the United States and beyond. In California, Florida, and the Midwest, Quonset huts were still being used as military warehouses, storage units, and industrial spaces, proof that a well-designed structure could stand the test of time, even after the chaos of war had ended. Interestingly, even after the Vietnam War, the legacy of these huts continued to influence military construction. The Nissen hut's basic principles, speed, simplicity, and immediacy, inspired the development of temporary military shelters that could be rapidly erected in combat zones. The Quonset hut, with its steel framework and integrated infrastructure, served as the model for long-term, semi-permanent military bases that were required to support large numbers of troops for extended periods. Both huts had proved their worth during wartime, but their futures diverged when the war ended. The Nissen hut's legacy was one of immediacy, practicality, and temporary relief, whereas the Quonset hut emerged as the long-term solution, still standing in use long after the war's end. But perhaps the most important lesson from these two structures was the balance between speed and permanence. The world had learned that in the face of war, what was needed wasn't always what was best in the long term. It was the quick, effective solutions, the Nissen hut's simplicity, which gave soldiers a chance to survive, and the Quonset hut's durability, which helped them thrive in the years that followed. The legacy of both these huts, the Nissen's rapid shelter and the Quonset's lasting strength, wasn't just in their designs. It was in the lives they touched, the survival they ensured, and the hope they gave to countless soldiers in the darkest hours of the war. By the time the Vietnam War had come and gone, the world had undergone a massive transformation. The introduction of modern technology, the rise of satellite communications, and the dawn of military industrialization had fundamentally altered the landscape of war. But amid these advances, one thing remained clear. The lessons learned from World War II and from the Nissen hut and Quonset hut were still deeply relevant. The principles behind these two shelters had become so ingrained in military thinking that they would continue to influence the design of military structures for decades to come. What made the Nissen and Quonset huts so enduring wasn't just their functionality, it was their simplicity and efficiency in meeting the immediate needs of soldiers in combat. These were shelters built to withstand the chaos of war, offering survival and comfort where it was needed most. As modern warfare evolved, the need for rapidly deployable shelters didn't disappear. Military installations in remote locations, temporary forward operating bases, and even field hospitals still required the speed and flexibility that both designs had offered. But the challenges had changed. While the Nissen hut's simplicity had been ideal for wartime expediency, the Quonset hut's durability became the preferred solution for semi-permanent bases, particularly in military theaters where long-term presence was necessary. By the Cold War era, both the Nissen and Quonset huts were being used in different forms, serving as models for future military shelters. The U.S. military, after facing the limitations of temporary shelters during the Korean War, began to embrace the idea of modular construction, building structures that could be easily assembled and disassembled, but with the durability and comfort needed for extended military operations. The Quonset hut's design principles, particularly its steel framework and ability to house complex systems, were expanded upon in modern-day military structures. One of the most significant advancements came with the development of modern, containerized housing systems. These structures were built with the same principles in mind as the Quonset hut, quick to assemble, portable, and multifunctional. But unlike their predecessors, these systems used aluminum frameworks and fabric panels, weighing far less than the steel and corrugated iron of the Quonset hut. They could be airlifted into combat zones, assembled in a matter of hours, and deployed at a moment's notice. While this evolution in design was a product of modern needs, it still carried the DNA of the Quonset and Nissen huts that had been born out of wartime necessity. The use of Quonset hut-like shelters didn't end with the military. After the Cold War, the Quonset hut's influence began to take on a new role in civilian life. Around the world, temporary housing solutions modeled after the Quonset design were used for disaster relief, temporary shelters, and even affordable housing in rural areas. The simplicity and speed of the design continued to be a major asset in areas hit by natural disasters. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, for example, saw FEMA turn to modular housing solutions that could be deployed quickly, much like the Quonset huts of World War II. Moreover, the military's move to deploy modular shelters in combat zones and peacekeeping operations mirrored the same urgency that had defined the Nissen and Quonset huts in their respective eras. As deployable medical facilities, command posts, and barracks, these shelters served as the foundation for forward base operations, proving that the lessons of speed versus durability were not only still relevant, but crucial for modern military operations. Even in civilian life, the legacy of the Quonset hut could be seen in the construction of metal buildings used for warehouses, workshops, and agricultural structures. These buildings, though updated with modern materials, still bore the fundamental design principles of the Quonset: simplicity, strength, and adaptability. Across the United States, these once military-style structures continued to serve as foundations for small businesses or storage facilities, proving that their design was more than just a wartime necessity. It was an investment in practicality and longevity. In the early 2000s, companies like Porticamp and Mobile Mini began producing portable shelters inspired by the Quonset design. These prefabricated shelters were designed to be easily transported and quickly assembled, much like the original Quonset and Nissen designs. They became a popular choice for temporary housing in places like oil fields, construction sites, and even emergency relief camps. These modern iterations of the Quonset hut showcase the lasting impact of the military engineering principles that had been born during the Second World War. In today's world, the Nissen and Quonset huts are no longer used in their original form, but their legacy of rapid deployment, modular design, and adaptability to tough conditions has had a profound impact on the design of modern shelters and infrastructures. While newer technologies have replaced them in some respects, the core principles of simplicity, speed, and durability continue to resonate in everything from disaster relief efforts to military base construction. The Nissen hut's legacy may have faded from the forefront, but remains a symbol of wartime ingenuity, a testament to the brutal necessity of shelter in times of unimaginable adversity. And the Quonset hut, once a post-war solution, continues to shape the way we build in emergencies, temporary military deployments, and even long-term civilian infrastructure. The war had ended, but the influence of the Nissen hut and the Quonset hut would echo through the decades. These two seemingly simple structures had done more than just house soldiers. They had changed the way we thought about emergency shelters, military infrastructure, and even civilian housing. From the cold, muddy trenches of World War I to the vast stretches of land in Vietnam and beyond, the impact of these huts was undeniable. As the Nissen hut began to fade from military use, its legacy wasn't just about the speed of deployment, it was about the innovation that came from necessity. It had proven that in the chaos of war, when every second counted, sometimes the simplest solution could save lives. The speed at which it could be assembled had ensured that soldiers, who faced death from every direction, would have a place to rest. It was a symbol of wartime ingenuity, a reminder of what could be achieved when survival was at stake. The Quonset hut, on the other hand, carried a different legacy. Its durability and adaptability made it the choice for long-term military use and civilian infrastructure. As the years went by, surplus Quonset huts found new life in disaster relief efforts and post-war reconstruction. The insulated design and strong framework became the model for future shelters in military and industrial applications. For generations, the Quonset hut served as a testament to the idea that, while speed was vital in wartime, endurance mattered just as much in the peace that followed. But as the world moved into the modern era, the core principles of these two iconic structures, speed and durability, continued to shape military construction and emergency relief shelters. Newer technologies may have taken over, but the legacy of the Nissen and Quonset huts still lives on in the way we think about temporary shelters and modular construction. From disaster relief to temporary military bases, the Nissen and Quonset hut principles were the foundation upon which modern shelter technology was built. The impact of these huts stretched far beyond what they were originally designed to do. The Nissen hut's rapid deployment and the Quonset hut's enduring strength had shaped infrastructure on a global scale. They had been part of the effort to keep soldiers safe during the most intense periods of war, and later, part of the effort to rebuild and recover once the dust settled. As we reflect on their lasting influence, one thing becomes clear. The history of the Nissen and Quonset huts is a story of survival, ingenuity, and the resilience of those who faced the most difficult challenges of their time. And their legacy continues to remind us of the importance of adaptability, innovation, and the ability to rise above adversity. The Nissen hut's story may have ended, but the Quonset hut's legacy lives on, not just in the military, but in the homes, businesses, and communities it helped to build. They were more than just buildings. They were symbols of hope in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their story is our story, a reminder that even in the most difficult times, innovation can light the way forward. If you've enjoyed this journey through history and want to learn more about the remarkable designs and legacies that have shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on any future stories that continue to uncover the incredible moments in history that changed everything.